Okay, if I could have everybody's attention again, please. If everybody can come back. And welcome back to session 4 of today. And where I wanted to start this afternoon is looking at some of the neuroscience which can help to inform us as to what's going on with chronic pain and other kind of chronic health issues. And neuroscience has evolved radically in the last 10 or 15 years, primarily with the advent of imaging technology such as functional MRI scans. The amount of information and knowledge about the functioning and structure of the brain has escalated radically in the last 10 or 15 years. Now, one researcher that I'm wanting to refer to is a psychologist and neuroscience researcher by the name of Richard Davidson. Now, for the last 30 years, Davidson has been researching the brain basis of emotions. So he's looking at what's going on in the brain when we're experiencing particular emotions. He's been doing that kind of research for the last 30 years. Just this year, he produced a book called The Emotional Life of Your Brain, in which Davidson describes emotional styles. So these are characteristics which we all have, particular emotional styles which exist on a continuum. So on any one of these particular emotional styles, we can be thought of as being down the low end of the continuum or up the high end of the continuum. There's only 3 of these which I think relate really in an important manner to chronic pain, so I'm just purely going to focus on 3 of those. Part of what Davidson has worked out through functional MRI research is that these particular emotional styles can be related very solidly to particular brain behaviour. So as I said earlier today, the brain certainly functions as a whole unit, but it consists of a range of different what are called brain modules, the different components of the brain. None of these components exist in isolation, they all work together. However, there are particular roles of different brain modules. The roles aren't absolutely watertight in that sometimes different brain modules can take over particular roles if there's been brain damage or injury. But there are fairly typical kind of roles for each of these different brain modules. Now, one of the important emotional styles that Davidson refers to is the outlook style. And on one end of the continuum on the outlook style, there's what we may refer to as being emotional negativity. So these are people that are basically sad a lot of the time, find it difficult to maintain happy feelings, are obviously vulnerable to depression. And up the other end of the extreme, at the other end of the continuum, we have what are obviously the opposite to that, which is a positive emotional outlook style. And up this end, we have people that tend to be optimistic, tend to be positive in their general mood, tend to be quite upbeat and happy a lot of the time. So this is a basic emotional style that people obviously do differ on. Some people are more pessimistic, see the glass as being half empty, and are more likely to be saddened by realities of life. Other people are more optimistic, seeing the glass as being half full, and tend to be happier as a result. Now, what Davidson has found out through his brain research is that there are 2 parts of the brain, or 2 components of the brain that are highly important for this outlook emotional style. And these are the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain which basically sits behind our forehead. So the prefrontal cortex exists in both the left and right hemisphere of the brain. It's basically the area behind our forehead. Now, the prefrontal cortex traditionally has been viewed as being the seat of what are referred to as the executive functions of the brain. So this is where we tend to do our problem solving, our planning, our making sense of our experiences, philosophizing, etc. It tends to be highly rational, and involved in these executive functions. Now, the other important part of the brain relating to this outlook emotional style is referred to as the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is fairly deep set. Well, it's within the brain. It's in the region of your temples, but it's not on the surface. It's more deeply set in than that. And the nucleus accumbens is what's referred to as the head part, or the end part of another brain structure called the anterior cingulate cortex. And it's in the nucleus accumbens that we become aware that we feel happy. So it's a bit of a happiness centre. It's still part of the neocortex. It's not a deeper brain structure than the cortex. And what Davidson's research has found is that when people can be measured as being on the positive end of the outlook dimension, they have a lot of activity in their prefrontal cortex and a lot of activity in the nucleus accumbens, and they also have a lot of neural traffic in the pathways between these two brain structures. So there's a lot going on, a lot of communication going on between the prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens. Now, this differs to what's seen with people that are at the negative end of the outlook dimension. These people, the ones that are more pessimistic and basically sad or more depressive people, are seen to have much lower rates of activity in their prefrontal cortex, lower rates of activity in the nucleus accumbens, and also a much lower rate of neural traffic between these two parts of the brain. Now, it seems that the significance of these two parts of the brain and the connections between them are as follows. Most people, even people who are depressed or depressive people, generally are able to feel pleasure in any given moment. So Davidson's research involved things like showing people video footage of very pleasurable scenes, and it might be footage of, say, puppies playing. Most people are going to find that quite delightful to look at. Now, what the functional MRI scans show, and these are basically viewing what's going on in the brain in real time, so we can see what's actually happening while the person's undergoing this particular experience of watching the video. What happens is that the prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens become active in both happy people as well as depressive people. So happy people and depressive people don't tend to differ in the ability to feel pleasure in any particular moment. What then happens beyond that is of a great deal of interest. In order to maintain a positive outlook in life, we need to basically be able to maintain positive mood. And of course, this is what depressive people and pessimistic people really struggle with. They can feel pleasure in any particular moment, but the ability to maintain that pleasure so that it becomes a good mood, let's say for a day or for a few days in a row, or a general good mood, seems to be lacking in people that are more depressive and more pessimistic. So it's not so much the ability to feel pleasure in the moment that differentiates between people. We all, in varying degrees, seem to be able to do that. But it's the ability to be able to maintain that positive feeling, which we would then refer to as being a positive mood. Now, in people that are more depressive and pessimistic, what Davidson has established, what he's observed, is that the less activity in the prefrontal cortex and results in less neural traffic between the prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens. And he suggests that the prefrontal cortex plays a role of something like a cheerleader. So the prefrontal cortex in people that are able to feel optimistic and feel generally happy a lot of the time, the prefrontal cortex works really hard at keeping the nucleus accumbens in that more positive state. So basically the prefrontal cortex is saying, keep it up, keep on going, stay with this positive thing, don't give up now, no flagging, stay with this positive bit of stimuli, etc. The prefrontal cortex is almost playing a cheerleading type of a role. And it's doing that through this these neural pathways between the prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens. And because the prefrontal cortex is able to keep on urging the nucleus accumbens to stay attending to the positive stimuli and to stay in a reasonably happy kind of state, it appears that the person is therefore able to maintain positive mood. Now, when somebody has less activity in the prefrontal cortex, and therefore they have less neural traffic between the prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens, then these people tend to be more negative, and they exist on the questionnaires of emotional style. They're more likely to be found at the negative end of the outlook emotional style range or continuum. So in a nutshell, what we see is that people that are more negative have lesser observable neurological activity in the prefrontal cortex, in the nucleus accumbens, and between these two brain areas. And conversely, people that are more positive tend to have a whole lot more neural activity in their prefrontal cortex, in the nucleus accumbens, and in the neural pathways between these two brain structures. Now, this becomes a very important observation in regards to chronic pain, primarily as a result of some research that was reported just this year by Balicki and other researchers at, I think it's Northwestern University in America. And what they reported in a science publication called Nature Neuroscience was also research done with functional MRI scan observations. And they followed people over around a 10-year period. And what they're interested in seeing was, let's say if a bunch of people are participating in this research, they were interested in those that became injured and experienced back pain, acute back pain as a result of having an injury. Now, only a certain portion of those people are actually going to go on from experiencing an acute pain from a recent injury into people that are experiencing chronic pain from an injury that occurred more than 3 months ago, could be 3 years ago or 13 years ago. Only a certain portion of people are going to progress from having an acute pain through to having a chronic pain. And these researchers wanted to see what's going on differently in the brains of people that do progress onto having a chronic pain compared to what's going on in the brains of people that don't progress onto having a chronic pain. Their acute pain actually resolves within the 3-month framework. And what they discovered was exactly the same neural pathways and neural structures that Davidson had discovered in the outlook dimension of emotional styles. So what Balicki and his fellow researchers discovered was that people whose pain progresses on to become chronic show a great deal more neural activity between their prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens. So those whose pain ends in the acute phase, that's within the first 3 months of having the injury, these people show much less neural traffic between the prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens. And we're going to need to tease this out a bit. And it gets a little bit complicated, so bear with me if I bumble around trying to help you to make sense of the importance of this finding. What Balicki and colleagues found is that the exact same brain signature exists for people whose pain progresses on to become chronic, as what Davidson found is the characteristic brain signature for people that are more positive. And this is, there's very big importance in this finding. And neither of these groups of researchers have had any communication with each other, and as far as I know, they probably don't even know of each other's research or have not seen any significance in this confluence of their research. Part of the psychogenic model of chronic pain that I've been describing to you today, we can call it the TMS model, is that our brain generates pain in order to deflect our attention away from negative realities. And it does this in a protective manner in that it figures we can more easily deal with a chronic pain in our back, neck or shoulder or any other part of our body, then we can deal with the emotional pain that goes with the negativity. Now, the negativity may relate to either things that are going on in our lives now, less than rewarding relationships, feeling dissatisfied at work, feeling bullied or picked on by the boss, not getting along well with work colleagues, not getting along well with family members, conflicts with teenage children, worrying about elderly parents. There's no end to the amount of things that we can feel distressed about, obviously. But the brain figures that rather than allow us, and it can also relate back to historical forms of stress, so obviously historical traumas, abuse, neglect in our childhood, teenage years, etc. And as I've also described, there can be the flip side of a positive coin as well. Now, the theory is that, or the model is that, rather than have us actually dwell in the place of this negativity and sit with the negativity, our brain figures that this is way too disruptive to our sense of who we are, and it would cause enormous emotional problems were this negativity to fully erupt in its full enormity into our conscious awareness. And rather than have that occur, our brain is very able to create a very real physical pain, and often this is created through the autonomic nervous system constricting vascular smooth muscles around blood vessels, thereby decreasing the blood flow and therefore the oxygen supply to particular muscles, nerves and tendons, thereby producing a very real physical pain, which will then monopolise our attention, because that's what we're evolutionarily equipped to do. We're equipped to tune into pain and pay a great deal of attention to it, and thereby allowing the negativity, the negative emotions, to sink back into our unconsciousness where it figures it belongs, where we again lose awareness of the negativity. So in a way, the chronic pain is acting as a psychological defense mechanism by giving us a very real physical experience. Now, what's going on here is that rather than allow the negativity to be there, people that are vulnerable to chronic pain tend to be people that are trying to cultivate a positivity. Now, there's natural, spontaneous positivity which we can all experience. You know, we see a beautiful rainbow, or there's beautiful light from the rising sun or a sunset, and most of us can get a burst of pleasure and positivity from that. Or we achieve a task that we've been working on for a long time, or we hear a certain piece of music, or a friend gets in touch with us and has a good conversation, whatever it might be. Most of us are able to experience this kind of natural, spontaneous, in-the-moment positivity. And none of that constitutes a problem whatsoever. However, people that are vulnerable to chronic pain also tend to be the kind of people, like myself, who have tried to cultivate a certain positivity. In a sense, they've tried to engineer a positivity within themselves, cultivate a certain optimism within themselves. Now, I know that after my car accident when I was 18 years old, I was in such a bad emotional, psychological state that when I started to physically recover, around probably 6 months after the accident itself, I began to do all that I could to foster, cultivate, engineer a positive emotional and psychological state. Now, I viewed that as being entirely necessary because I had been in a very dark place for a good 6 months. And it was probably my first experience of being seriously depressed. Obviously, I was quite traumatized. But when I started to physically recover is around the time when I discovered self-help pop psychology books in my father's bookshelf. And I started learning how to try to cultivate an optimistic, positive attitude towards life. And I view that as being a good thing. It was probably highly necessary for me at the time. I really had no future in staying stuck in this highly negative, dark place. It wasn't going to work for me in any sense whatsoever. And so it really was quite a necessary thing for me to do, to find how to become more positive about myself, about my life, about the world in general, about the future, etc. And with the aid of the pop psychology self-help books, I really embarked on a fairly long sort of process of cultivating positivity within myself. Now, anybody that cultivates positivity must also be denying negativity to a certain extent. When we look at the glass being half full, of course that's entirely true. The glass is half full, but the other reality is that the glass is actually half empty, and that reality is just as true as the glass being half full. If we're trying to cultivate a positive, optimistic attitude, we're going to simply focus on the fact that the glass is half full, and we're going to need to deny the fact that at the same time, just as real, just as true, is the fact that the glass is actually also half empty. So in order to cultivate positivity and optimism, there's a certain amount of emotional denial, repression, and suppression of the negativity that must go on. It simply can't be any other way. And it was certainly the case for me, and it's been a case for many of the clients that I've worked with over the years, that they can really relate to this idea that in order to foster a positive mood as a general orientation towards life, it really takes some work. And as I said before, this is quite beyond the natural, spontaneous moments of pleasure that we can all experience. We're talking about the deliberate efforts to foster and cultivate positivity and optimism. Now, this worked for me really well as a, what would I have been, 18 and a half, 19-year-old. And for the next few years, it actually worked really well in that it helped me to pull myself out of the psychological morass that I was in. And my life really did turn around. Through this sort of surge of positivity, I discovered that I wanted to study psychology. I did what I needed to do in order to begin that process. And as I said, the positivity, the optimism that went with all that worked really well for me in a whole range of different ways. However, how it didn't work for me was that within possibly 6 months, certainly no more than 12 months of discovering the sort of pop psychology, engineering, positivity sort of approach to life, I developed the chronic pain in my groin that I mentioned earlier this morning. And this chronic pain in my groin lived with me for the next 18 years. Now, the conclusion that I've come to is that the positivity that I fostered within myself was essential at the time, and it was a wonderful, wonderful thing that I succeeded in doing for myself. However, it came at a cost, and the cost associated with that was the chronic pain in my groin. How are those two things related? As I said before, in order for me to cultivate and foster positivity within myself, I needed to engage in a lot of denial. And I needed to deny a lot of negativity within myself, and I needed to deny a lot of the negative aspects of my own life. And that's about the only way, well, that's certainly one half of the equation of becoming a very positive person. So in a sense, what I could see that I was doing in terms of Davidson's research is that for the first time in my life, I was very deliberately activating my prefrontal cortex and my nucleus accumbens, very deliberately focusing on generating this positivity via the actions of my prefrontal cortex and nucleus accumbens. And an enormous amount of neural traffic for the first time in my life would have been going from my prefrontal cortex to my nucleus accumbens. And through this, I developed a very positive outlook on life. However, in so doing, this is exactly the same set of brain activity that Balicki and colleagues discovered is actually relating to the production of chronic pain. So in their research, 85% of the people whose pain went from being acute and became chronic, i.e. long-term pain, 85% of these people showed the exact same neurological signature patterns of a high level of brain activity in the prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens, and a high level of neurological traffic between these two parts of their brains. So in fostering, cultivating, engineering positivity within myself, I was basically creating the same neurological signature that's relating to chronic pain. Of course, I had no idea of this at the time, nor did any other neuroscience researchers have any idea of this at the time. And this is going back to possibly around the time when Davidson was just simply beginning his 30-year research on effective neuroscience. So he certainly had no idea of any of this at the time either. Nobody did. However, I think what we can see is that in combining the research results of both Bialecki and Davidson, we can see that, yes, we can foster positivity within ourselves, which involves a denial of negativity. However, in doing that, we're actually creating the same neurological behaviour that makes us very susceptible to chronic pain. Now, what are the implications of this? The implications are actually pretty important. Again, it's difficult to articulate it, so I'm just going to do the best that I can. If we're wanting to overcome chronic pain, then it would be very good to have our brain activity working with that desire. There's not a lot of point just simply having a goal of overcoming chronic pain and leaving it at the goal, stating the goal. The goal itself is admirable, but it's not going in its own right. It's not going to create any changes. We've actually got to do something different in order to overcome chronic pain. Probably the first most important thing is that we have to internalise the kind of information that I've been presenting to you today. We have to understand what is generating chronic pain and what is its purpose. Why is our brain actually doing this to us to generate chronic pain? And we've got to train ourselves to think psychologically in answering those questions rather than thinking physically, where every other message that we're getting in the world, primarily led by the pain industry, is telling us to think physically about physical pain. That notion kind of makes sense, but as I've detailed earlier, the research simply doesn't support it when we're talking about chronic pain. So we've got to train ourselves to think psychologically about chronic pain if we want to have any hope of overcoming it. And that means that we've got to be thinking about what are its psychological causes, what are the experiences in our life, either happening now or happened in the past, which could be related to why our brain feels the need to protect us from the emotional consequences of those negative experiences. And that's a very important thing, to train ourselves to think psychologically about pain. And the other things that we need to do, take on board the sort of things that Davidson's talking about. So if we're wanting to have our brain working in conjunction with our desire to overcome chronic pain, then one of the take-home messages is that we need to stop trying to foster so much positivity. That might sound odd, and I'm certainly not suggesting that we need to begin fostering negativity. We don't need to become negative people. That would simply make us more prone to depression and ill health and probably even chronic pain. So the suggestion here is certainly not that we need to become extremely negative, pessimistic people. However, to the extent that we find ourselves trying to deliberately, consciously foster positivity through denial of the negativity, through repression of negative realities of our life, then that tendency to deny the negative is very much part of the brain behaviour of making us vulnerable to chronic pain. So the suggestion is that if you're wanting to decrease the level of neurological activity in the prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens and the amount of neural traffic between those two brain areas, then we need to stop putting so much energy into trying to be so positive. Now this can be difficult. Not only do we get a lot of messages from the pain industry about what produces chronic pain, but our culture entails an enormous amount of messages which we're all absorbing like the air that we breathe, basically, that it's highly desirable to be as positive as we possibly can be, to try to make ourselves as positive and optimistic as we can. There are many books in the psychology self-help market that, in fact, most of them are geared towards trying to help us to generate positivity in our lives. And the whole idea is that of our culture is that positive is essentially good, and positive emotionality is essentially good, and it's what we should all be aiming for at all times. And in fact, we should be trying to cultivate that within ourselves as much as we possibly can. Now, as I said before, I certainly appreciate the positivity that I had in my life that allowed me to emotionally and psychologically recover to a fair degree, not entirely, but to a fair degree from my own personal trauma. However, as I've said, it did come at a cost. And the cost that it came to me at, i.e. chronic pain for 18 years, is the same reason that's brought you along to this workshop today, that you're actually wanting to do something to reduce the chronic pain that you're in, or to help those that you care about reduce their chronic pain. So given that that's a very understandable goal, it begins to make sense to take on board what Baliki has found and to stop putting so much energy into trying to be as positive as we possibly can. Now, this might mean that we may deliberately choose to be a little more negative than what we ordinarily are, but this is not saying that we need to foster and cultivate negativity. In order to maintain a positive mood, our prefrontal cortex, as I said before, is acting like a cheerleader. It's saying, keep on going, keep on focusing on the positive, keep on looking at the glass being half full. And what I'm suggesting here we need to do, perhaps, is to, say, dampen down that level of cheerleading. Because that cheerleading also involves, don't look at the negative, don't pay attention to the negative, ignore it, deny it, repress it, suppress it, minimize it, pretend it's not there, just don't engage with the negative. And of course, this is the purpose of the chronic pain. Our brain is trying to protect us from distress by generating chronic pain and monopolizing our attention. There's some part of our brain that figures that we can't deal with the negative, that the negative is just essentially toxic for us, and we'd rather be in absolute excruciating pain for 20 years rather than actually face and deal with the emotional negative content of what's going on at an unconscious level. And I kind of suspect for most of us, most of the time, that's an over-alarmist position, that we can actually cope with more negativity than what our brain is giving us credit for. And we have more ability to actually cope, maybe not enjoy the negative aspects of life, but actually cope with them than what we've been giving ourselves credit. So the suggestion here to work with Baliki's notions is to simply dampen down the level of cheerleading that the prefrontal cortex is doing by simply creating space for the negative, allowing the negative to be there within ourselves or within our lives. Now, this can look like the following. Let's say if we're in a relationship that's hit a very bad patch and there's nothing terribly positive or happy going on in the relationship for a matter of weeks or months, the kind of brain behaviour that is likely to make us more vulnerable to chronic pain would see us trying to focus on the positive, the prefrontal cortex being a cheerleader saying, oh, it's really not that bad, things are okay, keep on focusing on what's good about the relationship, and I do believe the relationship is going to get better, and we've just got to keep on trying, and things will get better, I know they will, and this general sort of positive slant on things, which is all very admirable, and I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with it. However, if we want to address chronic pain and change our brain behaviour around chronic pain, then we need to be saying to ourselves something along the following lines. Yes, things can get better, and maybe they very will get better. However, right now, it's pretty dreadful. Right now, I'm really very unhappy. I don't like what's going on between myself and my partner. It makes me very sad or anxious or whatever the feelings are, or fearful for the future. I really don't like it. It feels awful. It feels rotten to be in this terrible pattern with my partner. I hope that things can get better. I believe that if we put in the effort, things could very well get better. but I just have to admit right now it feels really awful. Okay? So that's an example of refusing to engage in denying the negative. And we don't have to spend our whole lives in the negative saying, yes, it's all dreadful, it's awful, and it's horrible. And, I'm not suggesting that needs to become our primary emotional style, because, as I said before, that's simply going to make us feel really dreadful and disempowered in relation to the problem and overwhelmed, and that will probably even exacerbate your chronic pain or other health conditions. So that's not the suggestion at all. The suggestion is that you simply make space for the negative reality. So the reality is, right now, this relationship isn't going terribly well. Okay. The next reality might be, and I think there are things we can do about it. I think we can try to make it better through sincere effort and changing some of our behaviours towards each other, etc. And I think there's a good chance that we may be able to resurrect the relationship and get it back on track again. But right now, it feels pretty awful. So that's simply making space for it. It's allowing and acknowledging the negative reality, or the negative component of our current reality. Now, research on optimists have found that while optimists tend to do well in a whole range of measures, they also tend to be somewhat more disconnected from reality. So optimists obviously use a lot of denial and repression and suppression and minimising the negative in order to maintain a positive, optimistic attitude. And sometimes this can actually backfire on people. So the person that's always maintaining and cultivating positivity and optimism within themselves might be blundering along in their relationship, or let's say in their workplace and their job, thinking, no, everything's great, I'm doing a fantastic job, everybody loves me, my boss is really happy with me, all the customers are very pleased with the service that I provide, etc. And they may be really quite out of touch with reality. They may be one more complaint away from being sacked by their boss and finding themselves being unemployed. So optimists are actually far more likely to be in that scenario than are pessimists. Pessimists tend to be less happy, however they tend to have a better grasp of reality. So what I'm suggesting here is that if we want to use our brain to work in conjunction with us to help to decrease chronic pain, not dwelling in the negative, not fostering and cultivating negativity and misery, not spending all of our time whinging about how awful everything is, but simply creating a space for the negative aspect of our reality. Now, there's probably also positive aspects of our reality. Even when our relationship is going bad, every now and then, maybe you and your partner are able to have an enjoyable, rewarding conversation with each other and show a bit of kindness towards each other. Maybe if it's only once a week for 10 minutes, still that's a positive thing that can be built upon and might provide some clues about how to get out of the current negative pattern that you're in. So there can be both positive elements and negative elements operating within any reality. In fact, that's more likely to be the case. And the suggestion here is that we simply create space for, and we allow for an awareness of the negative rather than leaping straight into defence mechanisms of trying to deny, suppress, repress, minimise, etc., the negative. And if we're able to do that, then we're going to be doing the opposite to deliberately cultivating positivity. And keep in mind that deliberately cultivating positivity is what's actually related to an increased risk of chronic pain following an acute injury. So if we want to move away from that possibility, then my interpretation of the neuroscience research is that we need to start creating space for negativity, acknowledging it, recognising when it's there, and then actually dealing with it in whatever way seems to make the most sense. But the first part of dealing with it is actually acknowledging and recognising the reality of it. So getting out of the defence mechanisms, away from the denial, etc., and just deal with the fact that, yes, at the moment things aren't so great. Okay, so that's maybe another way of demonstrating that. If we look at in the Anglo-Celtic world, the English-speaking world, we tend to be more emotionally suppressed than in the non-Anglo-Celtic world. So if you look at cultures from, let's say, Eastern European or Southern European or Asian cultures, when, let's say, a major loss happens in somebody's life, let's say a loved one has died, there will generally, and I'm speaking in gross generalizations, and I realize that these can always be proven wrong in individual cases, but in gross generalizations, I think they're probably pretty accurate. In non-Anglo-Celtic cultures, when there's been the death of a significant person, there's generally a great outpouring of grief. People don't try to suppress their tears or their wailing and their moaning, etc. People generally give themselves permission to howl, to cry, even to scream, and to give whatever emotional expression to their distress that seems appropriate. Their culture actually gives them permission to do that. And it's not only, for the first 2 days you have permission to scream and howl and fall in a heap, but the non-Anglo-Celtic cultures give a lot of permission over a long period of time for grieving to occur, and for that grieving to be quite vocal and quite emotionally expressive. In the Anglo-Celtic world, the English-speaking world, we tend to be pretty well the opposite. There's more permission now for people to openly grieve and to give emotional expression to their grief than what there was 20 or 30 years ago. I guess the 1960s and 70s really shook that up a fair bit and opened us up as a culture. So we certainly do have more permission now. However, in the English-speaking world, we're still a whole lot more likely to not give a full emotional expression to our grief. So you'll see this at funerals, where people will actually work quite hard to hold it all together. And they may be gritting their teeth, and you might see their jaw muscles exploding, trying to hold it all back, hold back the tears, and looking stony-faced, and really working very hard at trying to hold it together, because there's still a cultural view that there's something wrong with either completely giving into your emotions or giving expression to your emotions. Everybody understands that we're allowed to feel grief, but there's still some in the West, there's still some kind of cultural taboos against, there's no rules against it, but there's still some kind of cultural taboos which have all internalized to a certain extent, that it's just not good form to be giving, great emotional expression, to go to a funeral and to be screaming and howling and shouting and collapsing on the ground in a pile of tears. It's just not viewed as being very good form in the English-speaking world, whereas in the non-English-speaking world, it's much more likely to happen. Now, it also happens to be the case, and I don't think this is any coincidence, that the non-English-speaking world has far less chronic pain than does the English-speaking world. So the cultures where people have much more permission to be emotionally expressive, to acknowledge and to give expression to grief and negativity, negative aspects of life, these happen to be the cultures that experience far less chronic pain than our culture does, despite the fact that these cultures are much more likely to be in the developing world, where people do a whole lot more vigorous lifting and twisting and bending, carrying very heavy weights from very young ages through to old age, without any of the OH&S principles about how to lift properly and how to bend properly, etc. So these cultures do an enormous amount of physical work still. They work physically in the same way that our grandparents used to work physically. They don't have anywhere near the epidemic of chronic pain that we've got in the Western, in the English-speaking world. And it's no coincidence that these are also cultures where people have permission to be emotionally expressive. So when it comes to things like grief, if we're wanting to engage our brain behaviour to help us move away from chronic pain, rather than getting rid of anything that would remind us of the loss, taking down photos, getting rid of the deceased person's belongings, etc., there could be a benefit in taking some cues from people in the non-English speaking world and simply having cues and reminders of the loss in our home environment or in our work environment, where we can actually see photos of the person that's deceased, the person that we loved, and we can have their belongings around us as ongoing reminders. rather than trying to push away that reality. It's not about, as I said before, it's not about overindulging in the negativity, but it's about creating space for negative realities. And life will always throw negative realities at us. That's just the nature of life. So we can actually allow ourselves to have reminders of the loss or the awful experience in our environment rather than trying to push it all away. Now, of course, the fear is that we can't cope with that, and this is why our mind/brain generates a very real physical pain in order to protect us from that. So when we, little bit by little bit, slowly move away from the extreme positive end of the outlook dimension, and little bit by little bit start moving towards the perhaps a more middle end part of that continuum, whereby we'll do that by not engaging in denial and repression and suppression and minimization quite so much. We won't engage so much in denial of the negativity. We'll allow more space, create more opportunity for us to be aware of the negative aspects of our lives. And if we do this in manageable bits and pieces, we'll find that we're actually able to cope with negative emotionality. The vast majority of us can cope with negative emotionality. And if you're actually moving from the extreme positive end of that outlook dimension, then you can afford to move a fair bit away from that, and you're still not going to get overwhelmed by the negative because you're still overwhelmingly positive, just not rigidly positive to the extent that you're deliberately trying to cultivate it all the time within yourself. So it's actually really important for us to begin to engage with the negative aspects of life, not immerse ourselves in the negativity, but engage with the negative aspects of life. And this is why in my book, The Hidden Psychology of Pain, I've got a full chapter which is nothing other than self-analysis questions. And these questions are inviting you to look at your life and your history to see if you can identify negative aspects of your childhood or teenage years, or negative aspects of your current life, your current relationships, etc. Not because I want you to spend the rest of your life engaging with these negative aspects of your life, but because these tend to be the parts of our lives that people that experience chronic pain have tended to ignore or deny. And they are the aspects of our lives that we have to give some kind of space for. So when you're working through my book, and you get to the self-analysis questions, I consider that to be a very important chapter. We need to engage with this by creating some kind of space for negativity. And by doing that in little bits and pieces and answering one question at a time and perhaps doing a little bit of work on that each day, you're slowly exposing yourself to negative emotions that go along with those and negativity in little manageable bite-sized bits. You're not overwhelming yourself by throwing yourself in the deep end of the negativity, but in little bite-sized, manageable bits, you're giving yourself small amounts of exposure on a daily basis by creating some kind of space for that. And this is slowly teaching our mind/brain that we can actually cope with negativity. That everything negative in our unconscious, all the distressed emotion and dilemmas and traumas, etc., don't actually need to be kept down there, and we don't need to engage, we don't need to use defense mechanisms, including chronic pain, because if we start to allow the negative emotions into our awareness in small bits and pieces, bite-sized manageable bits, then we're actually giving our brain/mind a new experience of being able to cope with negativity, and realizing that we don't actually have a meltdown just because we start to look at the reality that maybe my childhood wasn't perfect, or that my teenage years did involve some forms of distress. So giving our mind/brain little experiences of the negative aspects of our histories, of our lives, which is allowing us to slowly build up the emotional tolerance for those things. And this is a very important therapeutic element to overcoming chronic pain, that we need to develop the emotional tolerance for negative emotions. Okay. Now there are a couple of other dimensions of Davidson's emotional styles, which are actually really important as well, and they're highly related to what we've been talking about with the outlook dimension. And one of those is the resilience dimension. So at one, and this is again another emotional style of resilience. So at one extreme of this dimension, you have people that are highly resilient. They bounce back extremely quickly after adversity. Not much can keep them down, and they'll often amaze us with their ability to just keep on bouncing back. And at the other extreme end is the slow to recover people. So these are people that experience adversities and they just don't bounce back. It takes them, either they don't recover or it takes them a great deal of time and anguish in the recovery process. So let's say when we're talking about a death, the quick to recover people, a spouse dies or a parent or one of their children dies, and these people are going to bounce back really very quickly, and they'll be back at work in 1 week or 2 weeks, and they're just going to focus on their job again and get back on track again. Whereas the people that are at the slow to recover end of this dimension might spend years recovering, if they're going to recover at all. Now, obviously, this dimension of resilience is highly related to outlook, the outlook dimension. So people that are highly resilient are also the same people that are generally at the positive end, not always, that they are independent traits and characteristics, but often there's a high degree of correlation between being highly resilient and being highly positive on the outlook scale. So again, to the extent that people are resilient through the process of denial, repression, suppression, minimisation, etc., they're probably again making themselves vulnerable to chronic pain. And it does seem like we can either experience emotional pain. Let's say if a loved one has died, we can allow ourselves to experience the emotional pain, which is, a highly negative experience, and just simply be in that negative place for a while and give ourselves permission to cry and to grieve and to do whatever we need to do. And that's going to be an emotionally painful experience. Whereas the person at the positive and or the highly resilient end of the spectrum are going to probably deny or minimise or suppress the negativity of the loss. So they're going to be saying things like, then I'll just give extreme examples just to make the point, not that I think anybody's actually like this, but just as an extreme example, let's say they've got 4 kids and one of those kids has just died. They might be denying not so much the reality of the death, but denying the significance of the impact. They might be saying to themselves, look, it's okay, life goes on, I've got 3 other kids, and that's okay, that's all right, I can keep on going on. So again, I wouldn't want to criticise such a person. We all do what we need to do in order to cope and to keep our head above water. However, that person that says it's okay, I've got 3 other kids, I can push on, and a week later they're back at work and they're focusing on the figures at work, are probably the kind of people that are actually vulnerable to, at some point, either in the near future or the not so near future, to develop a chronic back, neck or shoulder pain or knee pain or ankle pain or whatever, chronic migraines or whatever it might be, or some other kind of chronic illness. So it seems that we can either experience emotional pain by allowing for the negativity, or we can experience a decrease in no emotional pain, but that's going to make us more vulnerable to experiencing a chronic pain. And in my book, I've provided a diagram which looks like a seesaw. At one end, we've got, in fact, I'll look for the overhead now, if I can find it. Shouldn't be far away. No, I can't actually find it. At one end of the seesaw, so imagine, 2 kids sitting on a seesaw. At one end, we can say it's the person that's suffering from emotionally generated pain, and they may be on the 2 sides of the seesaw The upside is, let's say, emotional pain that they can feel, and at the other end of the seesaw, the downside over that side of the chart is the physical pain that they can feel. So they're more likely to feel the emotional pain. That's likely to be high, whereas on the seesaw, the other end of the seesaw, the physical pain is likely to be low. Whereas somebody else, say the more emotionally resilient person with a positive outlook, might experience far less emotional pain, so that side is really down, but they're much more likely to experience chronic pain at some point as a result. And so that end of the seesaw is high up. Now, as in most seesaws, it's only occasionally in the movement of a seesaw up and down that it's at either extreme side. Usually the seesaw is somewhere in between two extremes, and most people are somewhere in between those two extremes as well. Okay, so moving on. Just trying to find out where I'm up to with the overheads. Okay. So, as I said earlier, it seems that a lot of the neuroscience has eventually caught up with people like Freud and William James. So Davidson and Bielicki are the types of neuroscience researchers that are providing quite a lot of evidence about the unconscious nature of brain functioning. Of course, none of us are ever aware of what's going on in our nucleus accumbens or our prefrontal cortex, unless you've been tuned into that. But obviously we can't feel any of that. Okay. All right. So again, allow me just to state this. Cultivated optimism and positivity leads to the maintenance of positive emotionality. This is what Davidson found. The half glass, and seeing the glass as being half full, requires ignoring the half empty part, which is denial. And in the maintenance of positive mood, denial of negativity is very common. And this suggests that psychological repression is neurologically associated with chronic pain. So maintaining a more positive emotionality is also associated with more chronic pain, as what Bielicki found. And indulging in more negative emotionality is actually related to decreases in chronic pain, or less susceptibility to chronic pain, let's say. Okay, so given the kind of evidence that I've suggested here, and also the evidence of between 20 and 30,000 patients that Professor Sarno worked with, and his own research finding that around 88% of his patients got better purely as a result of processing information in his seminar presentations. Given that state of evidence, and of course for myself, the evidence of my own body is undeniable in terms of a radical eradication of my chronic pain really very quickly, and for it to never come back again. And then me having seen this happen with a great many of my clients and many other mind-body psychologists and physicians as well, also seeing similar kinds of outcomes with many of their clients and patients. Given this amount of evidence, why is this approach not well known? Why is it not more popular? And I think there's a range of reasons for this. One is that, we're talking about the role that psychology can play in the causation of chronic pain. And in a sense, even though I've seen a lot of you nodding here today, and a lot of people that I present this model to can immediately relate to it, I'm not sure how intuitively appealing it is. I think to make a physical sense of a physical pain is intuitively appealing. And I find, even though I've been immersing myself in this approach for many, many years, I still find that if I have an inexplicable pain just happen anywhere in my body, my immediate default position is still to look for a physical cause. Now, obviously, if I've just fallen over and I've banged my knee, then I don't have to look too hard to find a physical cause. it's pretty obvious why I'm in pain. But that's not the kind of scenario that I'm talking about. If I get a physical pain that just pops up for no apparently good reason, then my immediate default position is still to look for a physical cause. Then I catch myself and think, hang on, I know too much about this to be sucked into physical causes. What's going on for me emotionally that could relate to this? I had an experience recently of speaking with somebody that had, she had a chronic neck pain which resulted from a car accident, and she'd been in pain for the last year or so, I think it was. And when I was talking to her, she was also into surfing, and I fractured 3 vertebrae in my neck about 7 years ago, I think it was, and picked up 2 disc bulges in the process. And she was talking about being very unhappy as she was unable to surf for the last 12 months while she's been in extreme neck pain. And later that day and the next day, and I was planning on going for a surf the next day, I actually felt a neck pain emerging within myself. And I had done nothing physical to generate that pain. But I think what had happened was that basically talking with her about her pain, her accident, and her disappointment with surfing, etc., being unable to surf, was basically a set of triggers for me to generate the physical pain, maybe degree of emotional trauma from me fracturing my own neck, and knowing that I was going surfing the next day, it basically gave me a bit of a dose of neck pain. Now, initially, my first thoughts are, what have I done to my neck? Have I twisted it in the wrong way? Have I done sudden movement or whatever? And it's only when I think about it a bit more that I go beyond that and I realise, oh, hang on, this is not about my biomechanics, this is about my emotions, what's going on for me at a deep emotional level that I'm not entirely aware of that could be generating this pain. And then, of course, I start thinking, okay, there's a similarity here between her accident, my own accident where I fractured my neck, her being frustrated with surfing, me going surfing tomorrow, etc. So it begins to turn up the gas on that particular stove in my unconscious, and the water begins to bubble up. And rather than have me immerse myself or be overwhelmed by the emotional distress that went along with that whole experience, the fear, etc., some protective part of my mind/brain via the autonomic nervous system constricts the blood supply to muscles in my neck, and those muscles then begin to suffer ischemia, which gives me a bit of a dose of pain. So it's not always the explanation that we're immediately going to naturally jump to. The approach to psychology that is built into this model is a depth psychology approach. And depth psychology has basically fallen out of favour in mainstream psychology in the last 20 to 30 years. I think this is incredibly unfortunate. But what's occurred in psychology in the last 20 to 30 years is the rise of cognitive behaviour therapy, CBT, which if most people have had any involvement with psychology or psychologists, they've most likely had exposure to CBT. Now, CBT has had almost a religious type following amongst psychologists for these last 2 or 3 decades. And that's not actually warranted. CBT, what meta-analysis research actually shows is that CBT is just about as good as any other approach to psychology. It's not actually better, it's not superior. It's about as good as any other approach to psychology. However, a lot of the adherents and the advocates of CBT have suggested that it's the only useful thing that psychologists can do with their clients. And like I said, I think that's very unfortunate, because what it's meant is that a lot of the other approaches to psychology that were around for the 100 years before CBT rose to be the flavour of the month or the decades, actually were also very useful and effective as well. And many of these other approaches have fallen out of favour because CBT has been the favoured approach. And what this means is that depth psychology approaches, of which psychoanalysis, Freud's approach, is merely one example of a depth psychology approach. But depth psychology approaches really fell out of favour with the rise of CBT. What this means is that most psychologists these days have no training in depth psychology, have really no awareness or appreciation of depth psychology. They will have read about Freud and other depth psychology approaches in their basic training, but they would have received no training in using any of those ideas. So I think this is one of the reasons why psychologists have, even when we're talking about chronic pain, psychologists are generally going to run with CBT, which is really geared towards helping people to learn to accept being in pain rather than using depth psychology approaches to help people to overcome their pain. So the preference has been to keep it on a superficial surface level, on the level of our conscious thoughts, which is what CBT focuses on. And of course, if we want to overcome chronic pain, we've got to actually go beyond the superficial surface level of thoughts, and you have to start delving in messy, complicated, unclear, murky emotions for which there's no clear, easy answers to, and it's a bit like an archaeological dig, and a fairly messy one at that. And sometimes you will easily hit upon the emotional, psychological factors that seem to be relevant to the chronic pain. And many times it's going to be quite an exhaustive process to try to work that out. So my own profession is basically settled for fairly simplistic, reductionist and mechanistic approaches to psychology, as in CBT, despite the evidence. The evidence shows that CBT is no more effective than any other approach to psychology, and in fact there's a lot of neuroscience research now to support the depth psychology approaches that were discarded 2 or 3 decades ago. There's often very poor working relationships between the disciplines that are involved, so psychologists and physicians and physiotherapists and chiropractors often just don't even speak the same language. There's often suspicion and ill regard between these different professions, which is fairly unfortunate. Sometimes that can be overcome with individual practitioners where great relationships can be created between psychologists and physicians. There's some GPs that I work fairly closely with that I've got great relationships with, and I view them as being excellent clinicians and very psychologically aware physicians. And there are some chiropractors and physiotherapists that I've had similar kind of relationships with as well. But often there's fairly poor relationships and fairly poor understanding between the different professions involved. There's also in our culture a thing called the mechanistic bias, which is the prevailing cultural norm. And this is the bias to view the human organism as though it's a machine, view the body as well as the brain as though it's a machine. And the fact is that nothing could be further from the truth. There's nothing machine-like whatsoever about either our physical organism or our brain, and certainly not about our psychological realities. However, with the rise of a particular approach to Western science in the 17th century, influenced by Descartes, who I've already mentioned, as well as Isaac Newton, a particular model and approach of science began to view the universe in general and the world and everything within the universe and the world as being like a machine. As I said before, there is nothing machine-like about nature or about the human organism in particular. This particular approach to science never went unchallenged. There was a philosopher, Rousseau, and there was also a history of Greek philosophy and science, which viewed the human as a living, growing organism, constantly capable of change. But we live in an era where the mechanistic bias is still the prevailing scientific norm. And what that means is that we've come to view the human organism as a clever collection of nuts and bolts. Whereas, and you'll often see this in pictorial presentations of the human brain, if they're giving a pictorial image, and you can look them up on the net, you'll see pictures of a skull with cogwheels, a whole series of cogwheels inside the skull, as though we're somehow a collection of cogwheels. Whereas what would be much better off seeing, or what would be a more accurate presentation of the reality, would, if you're going to represent the human brain and the organism pictorially, would be to show the brain as being something like a tree, a living, growing tree that has a root system and has a branch system with twigs and leaves that are growing and constantly changing. That would be a far more accurate presentation. In fact, if people are familiar with the book called The Brain That Changes Itself by neuroscientist Norman Doidge, you'll see on the front cover of his book the picture of a human head with a crack in the skull area, out of which is growing a plant with a beautiful flower on it. And that's, of course, Norman Doidge has written this book. It's all about neuroplasticity, the idea that the human brain is very capable of changing and we're constantly growing, and he's chosen to represent that with the image of a flower growing out of a skull. Okay, we will leave it here for a break and we will come back in 10 minutes. See you then.